me the word broken noses, saying, what in the world does that have to do with the book of Deuteronomy? There was a new director who was installed in the Brooklyn Museum in New York City to oversee the section of Egyptian artifacts. This new director was intrigued by the most common question that kept coming his way by those who visited. Why are all the noses broken off of these sculptures? And initially, he just assumed because it was, well, these things are thousands of years old. They're being discovered and unearthed, and then they're being transported, and that nose it sticks out, so it probably seemed that it would just break off in the normal course and wear of time. But he said as the more he investigated it, he came to realize they were purposeful acts of destruction. So many Egyptian artifacts have their noses broken. As he studied a little bit deeper into the Egyptian culture, he revealed why. Because the ancients believed that the spirits of gods would inhabit these stone or wooden idols. And if you broke off the nose of the idol, it would mean that the god could no longer breathe, and it would suffocate. In his work, he actually discovered sculptures with ears broken off so that prayers could not be heard to these gods. With eyes, as you see on the far left, you see one that has its eyes and his nose gouged out, eyes gouged out so that these idols would not be able to see sacrifices being offered to them. And he also discovered that the laborers who were skilled in stonework would often be hired as hitmen. If one person wanted to hurt another person, they would hire someone to go break the nose off of their idol because it rendered their gods worthless. Now, I know that's got to sound so strange to us, right? That's because we don't live in a world where people have wood and stone idols inside of their home. But it doesn't mean that we live in a world that doesn't have idols. Most of us have one in our pocket or in our purse or possibly even in our hand right now. You said, this isn't an idol. Well, it actually controls what we see. It controls what we hear. It controls what we say. It controls what we think. It controls how we feel. And it controls what we do. What do you think gods do? I would guess that if someone unearthed our society thousands of years from now and began uncovering the society of America, they would say, oh, these people, they carried their gods everywhere they went. They didn't just have them set up in their homes. And as we get back to Deuteronomy chapter number 4 this morning, we're going to deal with some interesting questions about idols, images, and the word God. And I'm going to challenge your thinking a little bit about the word God. And I hope that you listen carefully because I don't want to be accused of being a false teacher. But last week, we looked at Moses trying to give the Israelites some instruction, and he told them basically three things as they go into this new land, and it's going to be very similar to the Garden of Eden. So as you go in, obey God's word, because that's what Adam and Eve did not do. Display God's glory, which was the original purpose of Adam and Eve, to fill the earth. And repeat God's works, because you won't do the top two if you don't continuously keep God's works in mind. And so tell them to the next generations. Today, as we begin in verse number 15 in just a moment, we're going to look and see why Moses tells these people, there's one God who deserves your obedience, and his name is Yahweh. So let's begin in Deuteronomy chapter number 4, verse number 15. It says, you saw no form of any kind the day Yahweh spoke to you at Horeb. Now, the word Horeb is another name for Mount Sinai, if you could think of that. So we know what happened at Mount Sinai, right? It's where God gave the 10 Commandments. You saw no form of any kind the day Yahweh spoke to you at Horeb out of the fire. Therefore, watch yourselves very carefully so that you do not become corrupt and make for yourselves an idol, an image of any shape, whether formed like a man or a woman, or like any animal on earth, or any bird that flies in the air, or like any creature that moves along the ground, or any fish in the waters below. And when you look up to the sky and see the sun, the moon, and the stars, all the heavenly array, do not be enticed into bowing down to them and worshiping things that Yahweh, your God, has apportioned to all the nations under heaven. Now we read those, a couple of verses, and becomes really clear. Yahweh wants to make sure they don't make any idols of anything. And he says, don't make it like you. Don't make it like the animals. Don't make it like the birds. Don't make it like the fish. Don't make it like the sun and the moon and the stars and the heavens. Like nothing. So why would Yahweh be so... Why would he be so particular about this? We've got to remember who he's speaking to, right? These are people who lived in Egypt. And in Egypt, you could not worship a god if you didn't have an idol. The spirits of those gods needed a place to inhabit. So you couldn't worship a god unless you could bow down to something, whether it was the sun or whether it was the Nile River or whether it was an idol of stone or wood. And he knows this, and he knows who he's talking to, and it's ingrained in these people's minds. We see it because if you go back, immediately after Yahweh says, you shall not make any graven images, what do the people do? Well, they build a golden calf. But think with me. If you go back and read about the golden calf being built, the golden calf is brought out of the fire, and the people immediately say, this is the God that brought us out of Egypt. But they're not stupid people. They know the God just came out of the fire. They know they've already been saved from Egypt. It would have been months ago at this time. What they're not saying is this golden calf is our God. What they're saying is this golden calf is now going to be the home of our God, so let's bow down to this golden calf. Does that make sense? And so what Yahweh is saying is, don't make an idol out of anything that you think I'll inhabit, because what will happen is you will begin to bow down to that idol in worship of me, but eventually you will worship that idol. But there's also another reason he said that, because Yahweh has already made an image of himself. Genesis 1:26 and 27 tells us that God created mankind in his image. Men and women are the image of God. And you know what I find so interesting about that statement? The image of God has actually become an object of worship. The exact same thing Yahweh was saying is, don't take an image and bow down to it, or you're going to begin to worship the image. And that is exactly what has happened. Millions of dollars every year are spent on this image. We buy fitness memberships. We follow the diet fads. We purchase expensive clothing. We work to make our hair look as beautiful as it can. Why? Because this image is really important to us. Sometimes more important to the God of the image. But we don't just worship our image, we worship the images of others. Billions of dollars are spent on pornography every year to look at the image of someone else and find pleasure. The image has become a marketing tool to sell everything from cars to pencils. Sex trafficking, abortion, and the LGBTQ agenda, it all comes back to the worship of the human body. We have turned the image of God into a God. And instead of allowing the Creator to determine good and evil and right and wrong, we say, I will determine right and wrong, meaning I will be my own God. And I know we don't actually use those terms. Like, we don't say, I am my own God. But we live like it. We live like it. And without even noticing, what we're doing is we're taking things and flipping them upside down. Things that were given to us to serve have now become things we serve. Like money. Money is a very good tool. Money helps us have a wonderful life until we begin to serve money. And when we serve money, we lie, we cheat, some people even kill because money has become the God. Many parents in this room, I hope that you listen to what I say and understand. I'm not trying to tell you how to raise your children. But God did not gift us with children so that we would serve them by giving them everything that they want. You see, we are to train our children to love and serve God and others, not to love themselves and expect to be served by God and others. I've failed on so many levels as a dad, and if you had a chance to sit down with my children and my wife, I'm sure they could tell you the many times that dad has failed. But one thing that has been very important to me is to ingrain in the lives of my children how to serve other people. Some of it just came natural because, well, we were the first family to arrive at church every week. We are the last family to leave church every week. We set up for all the events. We tore down from all the events. And I know that my kids, I know that they didn't love it. There's one moment in particular when we were in Virginia. In order to set up for a meal after church, we had to wheel 20 round tables and 150 chairs from one end of the church property where they were in the cafeteria all the way to the gymnasium, which was on the other end of it would take an hour just to move the chairs and tables. And then it would take the same amount of time after the dinner was over to move everything back. And there was one Sunday when the church meal was coming to a close, and you know what that means. Typically, when the meal comes to a close, people are starting to leave. And my son Trevor, who just recently got married, and he's visited here a few times, Trevor was standing in the midst of a group of friends, and they were all walking towards the door. He was a teenager. I think he was a junior in high school. They were all walking towards the door, and I saw that, and I was like, Trev, grab a chair, man. I don't want to be here all day. And he turned and he looked at me. And he didn't have a smile on his face. He had big tears welling up in his eyes. He didn't say a word. He just started to grab some chairs. But I know what he was thinking. Why do I have to be the one to stay when all my friends are leaving? We got in the car on the way home, and he was still upset with me, and I could tell. Not angry, mad at me, just frustrated that our family was always the one doing the work. And I told him, son, I can't control what anybody else does. But in our family, we're not going to pass up an opportunity to serve. If someone's walking in a door, hold it for them. If someone's carrying a box, ask if you can carry it for them. If someone's working, walk up to them and say, hey, how can I help you? Our kids don't get that. They have to be trained to do this. When I was a youth pastor, I set up a specific event to reveal to the young men, the high school boys that I had a chance to lead, to show them how much they desire to be served and how little they look to serve. I set up this meeting, and they were forced to walk outside, down a sidewalk, and then into a double set of doors. I worked with one of our Christian school teachers, and I said, hey, I want you to park your car right on the curb outside those double doors. Lift your hood open and stand there looking at your engine while talking on your phone. Then I asked a teenage girl, I said 3 times while the boys are kind of gathering, I want you to walk in the front door with a box in your hand, walk down the middle aisle and all the way through. Don't say anything, just walk down the middle aisle with that cardboard box. Do it 3 times. And then I took a couple boxes of paper clips and I threw them all over the floor right as you walked in the double doors. Everybody, once all the guys gathered in, I said, hey, fellas, let me ask you a quick question. How many of you saw Mrs. Crockett out there with the hood open, talking on her phone, and like almost everybody raised their hand? I said, how many of you walked over to ask her if you could help her? About 5 guys. I said, hey, how many of you guys noticed that young lady carrying the cardboard box down the aisle? She did it 3 times. How many of you saw her do it at least once? Almost everybody raised their hand. I said, how many of you offered to carry the box for her? Just a few guys on the aisle. I said, how many of you guys noticed like the hundreds of paper clips when you stepped in those double doors that you walked over? And by this time, everybody knew what I was doing, so I had a lot less hands go up this time. Like, I didn't see him. I don't know what you're talking about. But a number of guys raised their hand like, yeah, I saw him. I said, I stopped 2 people. I stopped 2 people who bent over to start picking those paper clips up. Our kids are so used to being served that they have developed the mindset, if I do any work, I should get paid for it. And we do. Which then asks the question, like, who's training who? Are our kids training us to pay them to work, or are we training our kids to be servants? I know this isn't a pat on my back. I'm just telling you, our children are grown now. What I find such joy in is when we get together occasionally and we have a meal. After the meal, nobody says anything. Those kids immediately get up. They start taking each other's plates. They make sure that the dishes get washed, that the table gets cleared, that the garbage goes out after if it needs to. We don't even ask them. And I just sit back sometimes like, oh, thank you, Jesus, for helping our kids see how important serving truly is. I don't know if there's something greater that someone can tell me, and I hear it regularly. Hey, man, I love your kids working with me because I don't even have to tell them what to do. They're looking for what to do. The very first job I ever got, my dad told me, I was pulling in shopping carts from a grocery store. That sounds like a lucrative job, right? I was getting paid $4.75 an hour to bring in shopping carts from the parking lot. Here's what my dad told me on before my very first day of work. He said, boy, they're not paying you to sit around. So if you don't have any carts to pull in, find a broom and start sweeping. I was on that job. I pulled carts for 6 days, and then they promoted me. I was working with guys who had been pulling carts for 6 months. And that has nothing to do with me. It has everything to do with this world is looking for people who know how to serve and know how to work. And hey, parents, it doesn't happen naturally. Naturally, we are lazy. Teach your children how to serve, how to share, how to work, and to do it without having a hand open saying, what do I get for it? And I'm not telling you how to raise your children, but we have to understand, if we are God's imagers, we should rightly represent who our God truly is. And what did Jesus say about himself? I did not come to be served, but to serve. So if we're going to image our God rightly, then we need to be servants. Let's keep reading in Deuteronomy chapter number 4. What we're going to find out is Moses is going to use some strong language. And so let me tell you before we begin reading what we're looking for. We're going to read a number of verses. I'm going to read from verse 20 to verse 40 in just the next couple of minutes. But I want you to understand what we're looking for. We're looking for descriptors, words that Moses uses to describe Yahweh. And some of them are tough. But at the end, we're going to step back and we're going to try to bring all these descriptors together to say, why does Moses say what he says? Look at verse number 20 with me in Deuteronomy chapter number 4. It says, but as for you, Yahweh took you and brought you out of the iron smelting furnace out of Egypt. Those words are used because Egypt, they would have been in slavery under the hot desert sun. But notice these next words, to be the people of his inheritance, as you now are. Yahweh was angry with me because of you, and he solemnly swore that I would not cross the Jordan and enter the good land Yahweh your God is giving you as your inheritance. So I have two descriptors of Yahweh here. The first is that where it says, you are to be people of his inheritance. If you think of the word inheritance, you can almost substitute the word possession. Not perfectly, but basically when you receive an inheritance, you are being given a possession. And what Yahweh says is, you're going to be my inheritance. I'm going to take you, Yahweh, as my possession. I'm going to take you, Israel, as my possession. And then we secondly see the indicator that Yahweh was angry. There's a lot of people who think of God as an angry God. Well, we do see here a little bit that he is angry. But why is he angry? Well, let's keep reading. Verse 22. Moses says, I will die in this land. I will not cross the Jordan. But you are about to cross over and take possession of that good land. Be careful not to forget the covenant of Yahweh your God that he made with you. Do not make for yourselves an idol in the form of anything Yahweh your God has forbidden. For Yahweh your God is a consuming fire, a jealous God. So this is the third time in 4 chapters that Moses says, I'm not going in with you. And I think by this time, he's not saying it just to make them feel bad. I think at this time, it's a warning. Hey, your parents and grandparents didn't get to go in because they were rebellious. I'm not going to get to go in, even though he chose me to lead you. You can't be rebellious and get away with it with Yahweh. I think he's warning them about that. And then he says, because Yahweh is jealous. Man, like jealous and anger, that kind of goes together, right? Like sometimes very jealous people are very angry people. Those don't sound like good descriptors of Yahweh. So why is he saying this? Well, let's keep reading. Verse 25. After you have had children and grandchildren and have lived in the land a long time, if you then become corrupt and make any kind of idol, doing evil in the eyes of Yahweh your God and arousing his anger. I'm so sorry. I was off with this. Right? We see the word anger highlighted again. Verse 26. I call the heavens and the earth as witnesses against you this day, that you will quickly perish from the land that you are crossing the Jordan to possess. You will not live there long, but will certainly be destroyed. Verse 27. Yahweh will scatter you among the peoples. Only a few of you will survive among the nations to which Yahweh will drive you. There you will worship man-made gods of wood and stone, which cannot see or hear or eat or smell. But if from there you seek Yahweh your God, you will find him if you seek him with all your heart and with all your soul. And when you are in distress and all these things have happened to you, then in later days you will return to Yahweh your God and obey him. And then look at verse 31. For Yahweh your God is a merciful God. He will not abandon or destroy you or forget the covenant with your ancestors, which he confirmed to them by oath. Now, I know there's a lot of verses we read, but if you can encapsulate it, Moses was saying, listen, if you become corrupt, this is what's going to happen. You're going to end up in other nations ruled by other people. It's exactly what happened. But the way Moses words it, he doesn't really say if. He more like says when. Like when you become corrupt people, this is what's going to happen to you. However, your God is merciful. And if you return to him, he will take you back. So we see this descriptor of Moses, from Moses of Yahweh. Yahweh possesses Israel, but he's an angry and a jealous God, but he's also a merciful God. And when it talks about his mercy, one commentator said, was it wise of Moses to tell them this? Doesn't this just give them the idea they could go live however they want, and whenever they decide to repent and come back, that they can? Well, there's some truth to that, but Moses does tell them the cost. He says, if you turn against Yahweh, you'll never lose Yahweh. He'll always take you back, but you will lose the blessings of Yahweh. You'll not get to keep the land. You'll not get to have the rest, and you won't enjoy the freedom and abundance that promised land offers you. I look at that and I realize, in our own lives, we'll never lose Jesus. And he has paid the eternal debt for our sin. But we have to understand there's still an earthly cost for our sin. Jesus will always forgive you, but a judge may not. He may hold you accountable for what you do. Jesus will always forgive you, but your family and friends may not trust you or want to be around you. Jesus will always forgive you, but your sin may cost you the most treasured relationships on this earth. Our sin will never keep us from eternal life with God, but it may keep us from an earthly life with joy. As many people have heard before, and I don't know who said it, you can choose to sin, but what you can't choose are the consequences of your sin. Right? There's something that is going to happen in our earthly lives because of sin. I was recently listening to a podcast where a pastor was talking about making a visit to prison to visit one of his fellow pastor friends. And he said, when I was sitting with him in that prison place, he said, I asked him, did you ever discover at some time in your life that you just fell out of love with Jesus? I think this is so huge for all of us to hear. The pastor replied, the one in prison replied, I never stopped loving Jesus, and I never stopped understanding Jesus loved me. Where I failed was to have a healthy fear of God. I always knew I'd be forgiven, but I never felt like there would be circumstances or consequences to my actions. I always knew I had forgiveness from the Lord, but I didn't live in fear of the Lord. I think a lot of Christians fall into that trap, thinking, well, my sin doesn't matter. But it does. Verse 32, would you look with me there? Moses is going to talk about how amazing what happened to them really is. Verse 32, he says, ask now about the former days, long before your time, from the day God created human beings on the earth. So go back to day one. Ask from one end of heaven to the other. Span the heavens. Has anything so great as this ever happened? Or has anything like it ever been heard of? Has any other people heard the voice of God speaking out of the fire as you have and lived? Right? Like you see what Moses is saying? You experienced something amazing. No one else has ever had this happen to them. And then he says in verse 34, has any God ever tried to take for himself one nation out of another nation, meaning Israel out of Egypt, by testings, by signs and wonders, by war, by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, or by great and awesome deeds like all the things Yahweh your God did for you in Egypt before your very eyes? Right? You understand what he's saying in this verse? Like you got to understand, has any God ever done what happened to you? So we see those words he's taken for himself. So this goes back to that Yahweh possessing Israel. He's choosing Israel for himself. But notice those words, has any God? Like really what he's saying is, has any God ever done this for their people? And immediately that leads me to this question. Like, wait a second, I thought that there was only one God. But then I realize Yahweh himself, the one true God, when he's giving instructions about Passover in Egypt in Exodus 12, he says, I'm going to bring judgment on all the gods, plural, all the gods of Egypt. I am Yahweh. And even when he gives the 10 Commandments, You shall have no other gods. It's almost like this is an assumption that there's other gods that can be placed before Yahweh. I don't know. I guess I always thought there was just one God, but Yahweh, the one true God, seems to indicate there's other gods. Well, let's keep reading in verse 35 and see if this clears anything out. You were shown these things so that you might know that Yahweh is God. Beside him, there is no other. Oh, okay. From heaven, he made you hear his voice to discipline you. On earth, he showed you his great fire, and you heard his words from out of the fire. Because he loved your ancestors and chose their descendants after them, he brought you out of Egypt by his presence and his great strength to drive out before you nations greater and stronger than you, and to bring you into their land, and to give it to you for your inheritance or your possession as it is today. Verse 39, acknowledge and take to heart this day that Yahweh is God in heaven above and on earth below. There is no other. Keep his decrees and commands which I am giving you today, so that it may go well with you and your children after you, and that you may live long in the land Yahweh your God gives you for all time. Okay. So in these 6 verses, twice we read, there is no other God than Yahweh. But wait. The verses that we just looked at earlier, Yahweh himself was saying, I'm bringing judgment on other gods, and you shall have no other gods before me. This is confusing. Is the one true God saying there's other gods? I want to show you, don't turn to them. I want to show you 2 verses that may help you understand a little bit about what Yahweh is speaking. These 2 verses talk about 2 cities. The first one is Nineveh. The second one is Babylon. When these 2 cities existed, they were the capital cities of the world. They were the most powerful, most wealthy cities in the world at their time. And it says in Zephaniah chapter 2 that Nineveh says about herself as a city, I am the one and there is none beside me. And in Isaiah 47, that Babylon boasts, I am and there is none beside me. Wait, so are these cities saying I'm the only city that exists? Of course not. These cities are saying there's other cities out there. None of them compare to me. I am incomparable. None can come close to who I am or to what I am. And so it's very possible that what Yahweh is saying is, there's gods in Egypt. And there's going to be gods in the land that you go to. Don't you dare put them before me, because I am incomparable. There is no God that is like me. No God is beside me. I alone am the creator of all things, and for you, Israel, I am your redeemer. Okay, now let's put all of these descriptors together. Yahweh possesses Israel. He's an angry God, he's a jealous God, he's a merciful God, and he is an incomparable God. He is unlike any other. And this leads to this question: why does Moses present the characteristics of anger, jealousy, and mercy, the possession of Israel, and the incomparability of Yahweh? Why does he present them to Israel before they enter the promised land? And I hope that you're ready for this, because it's really cool. It goes back to the purpose of why Yahweh spoke the 10 commandments or the 10 words to Israel. If you were here not long after I arrived in last September, October, November, we walked through what took place at Sinai. And if you were here, maybe you remember us saying there was a ceremony that took place at Sinai. Does anybody remember what kind of ceremony that took place at Sinai? It was a wedding. It was a wedding. See, Yahweh at Sinai was making a marriage covenant with Israel. And here's what he said, right? I will be your God. You will be my people. Oh. Almost as if Yahweh was claiming possession of them. Now you got to think with me, right? When a couple gets married, do they belong to one another? Yes, they do. Right? The Song of Solomon says, like, I am my beloved and my beloved is mine. Like, I have given myself to my wife at our wedding altar. I gave myself to her. And we read, well, Yahweh has made Israel his possession. And when a man and woman get married, is she the only woman in the world that exists? Well, of course not. Not the only woman. Is she an incomparable to every other woman in the world? Oh, she better be. When I married Jamie, I knew this isn't the only woman in the world, but there's no other woman in the world that can compare to my wife. And what Yahweh is saying is, I chose you for myself. You should choose me for yourself and say, there is no other God like my God. He is incomparable. And after a couple gets married, if a bride were to be unfaithful to her husband, would you expect the groom to be angry? Or to be like, it's no big deal. Right? He's angry, and it's not a sinful angry. He's angry that his bride has broken the marriage covenant to which they entered. And if Yahweh is fully committed to Israel, he brings them their freedom. He defeats their enemies. Should we be surprised that he is angry if they break their covenant with him and go after other gods? Oh, so that's what it means to be an angry God. Not a sinful angry, but an angry that the covenant we made has been broken. And if a husband who made a covenant with his bride at a wedding altar, if he were to be unfaithful, would you expect the bride to be jealous? Yeah, because my husband went to seek pleasure in someone other than me. That would make me very jealous. And what Yahweh is saying is, I've given you everything. I've given you the manna, the water, this promised land filled with milk and honey, and you're going to go to other gods to find pleasure after all I've done? I stop and I realize in these about 25 verses that we just read, Moses is instructing Israel by giving them a marriage seminar. You are his one and only. Do not seek after other gods. If you do, though, let me tell you about your God. He is merciful. If you go that way, which I know you will, so can we say when you go that way, here's what I want you to know. Anytime you desire to return to him, he will take you back because he is merciful. And I sit there and I was studying this and I'm like, this is so cool. And I know there's people here today who are like, okay, neat. What does this have to do with me at all? This is 2024, Brian. Yeah. Well, see, just as Yahweh entered a covenant with Israel, Jesus, who is Yahweh in the flesh, he extends a covenant with believers today. Well, what did he say? Hey, this cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is shed for you. Whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. I stand at the door and knock. If anybody hears me and opens the door and invites me, and I will sit with you, and you will sit with me. And if you accept the terms of the covenant, you get to become the bride of Christ. If you're the bride of Christ, you become his possession. And what's amazing is he becomes ours. We're in Christ, and Christ is in us. And he's preparing a place just like he did for Israel. He's preparing a place for us to be together, but for us it'll be for eternity. Jesus is fully committed to us. And he showed the commitment, like, I'll go that far, by laying down his life, and then he promised to never leave or forsake us. So I guess the question that bears asking as we close, will we keep collecting idols and worshiping other gods, or will we break off their noses and suffocate them? And I know you say, well, how do I break the noses of the idols in my life? I think that we choose to purposely spend time with Jesus, and we choose to shut off the other gods. I'm talking like turn off Netflix and Peacock and Hulu, I'm saying like turn off Spotify and Apple Music and leave your phone on the counter. Step away from your computer, take your Bible, and go to a quiet place. That's how you break the nose off of this idol. Put it away. Turn it off. And pick up this word. And just go to a quiet place and spend time with the God who has chosen you. How you break the nose off of money being an idol? You give it away. Go find somebody in need and sacrificially give to them and don't tell anybody. And what you're saying to money is, you're not my God, I don't serve you, you serve me. Invest your time in someone and don't tell anybody. Just go for a walk with Jesus and just talk to him. Break the nose off the idol in your life. And when you do, praise Jesus more for who he is than for what he does or what he gives us. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to ever get away from praising Jesus for the cross. But, right, he did more than this, right? Like, he left heaven. That's pretty amazing. He walked on this earth in a perfect life. That's pretty amazing. He gave us his righteousness. That's amazing. He has invited us into the heavenly places to be an heir, a co-heir with him. Ha! But most importantly, it's like, we want you, Jesus. I want you, not what you're going to give me. I didn't come out here to walk with you so you will answer a prayer. I came out here to walk with you to remind you that I want everything that you are. And then just live as the image you represent. Love others as you have been loved. Serve others as you have been served. And make disciples. That's what he said to do, right? That's what Jesus did when he was here. So we live like the one that we represent. I don't know if that moved you as much as me, but that was really exciting. And let's go break some noses off idols this week, church. Would you pray with me? Father, I thank you so much, man, for your word is just there's so many layers of understanding. We praise you for who you are, and we